Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Truog, Associate Director of the Center for Financial Security at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome to today's webinar on tax time savings decisions. Our presenter today is Damon Jones, Assistant Professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Our discussants are Mimi Turchenitz, Campaign Director of the Boston Earned Income Tax Credit Coalition, and David Rothstein, Project Director for Asset Building Policy Matters Ohio, and a Research Fellow at the New America Foundation. A quick housekeeping item. If you have any technical difficulties today, please call 1-800-442-4614. And to submit your questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar, locate the dark gray bar near the top of MediaSite, click on the Ask a Question icon, and a window will open. Please type your name, email address, and your question and hit send. And we'll be accepting questions throughout the webinar today. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Damon.
Okay, thank you, Nicole, for having me. And we can start on slide 1. And I just wanted to note that this research project is joint work with Aprajit Mahajan, who is a professor in economics at UCLA. And also, we have received support from the Social Security Administration via the Center for Financial Security as a part of the Financial Literacy Research Consortium. But all opinions expressed here are solely those of the authors. Okay, so we can go ahead to slide 3. I'll give an overview. I'm going to start with the research questions that we are aiming to address with this project. So we have 3 questions here. And so the first question is, what role does impatience play in sort of determining the savings decisions among low-income households? And I will be more explicit about what we mean by impatience in a second. So the first thing we want to do is to see if there's evidence of impatience playing a role empirically in a specific way. And then the second question is, depending on whether impatience does seem to be playing a significant role, are there ways that households are aware of this impatience and willing to take steps to curb some of the effects of this impatience? And I will also explain that in more detail in a second as well. And then finally, the context that we are working in, as you know, involves savings at tax time. And so we're looking at this in the context of a savings incentive that is offered to tax filers during the tax season. And so a corollary sort of question is sort of how do these policies or these incentives affect the overall household well-being? There are a number of reasons why we might think that savings could be a positive, but there are also some cons as well, and so we want to see how those things tend to balance out over time. And what we present today will be preliminary results from the ongoing project that I'll discuss, and we'll be saying much more about numbers 1 and 2 than number 3 today. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about what we mean by impatience. When we say impatience, we are talking about a particular phenomenon that grows out of the literature of behavioral economics. And so what the term that is used in this literature, there are a number of terms that refer to the same similar phenomenon, but the term we'll be using most frequently is that we're looking for what are called present bias preferences. You may have also heard these referred to as hyperbolic discounting or a beta-delta model. And so what this has to do with is how people value consumption or utility over time when certain things will take place in the more distant future relative to the present. Okay, so when we say discounting, we're talking about the fact that people tend to place more weight on immediate benefits relative to delayed benefits. So, Nicole, you can go to the next bullet point. So when we talk about present bias, it's not just that someone places more weight on the immediate benefits relative to later benefits. It's that they appear to be particularly impatient when the benefit that will be realized earlier in time can also be consumed right now. So there's a question of how do you compare a benefit now versus one that will happen later versus a comparison of two benefits that are in the future, one that can happen later and one that will happen even further in the future. And so the question is, do people act differently, and in particular even more impatient, when they are trading off between a benefit that can be realized and experienced immediately? And I will have an example shortly that will help to make more sense of this. So if you advance to the next bullet point, Nicole, on slide 4, these models tend to have certain predictions that that can be tested in different areas, and we will try to test for some of these predictions. In general, this model kind of predicts that people will tend to delay investments potentially indefinitely. And what I mean by delay is that a phenomenon may arise where someone would like to save, but they will tend to put it off until some time in the future when they think they'll be more willing to do it. But when that time does indeed arrive, they again make a decision to delay and push things further into the future, i.e. procrastination. So this is one of the phenomena that are predicted by this model. Another is that people will tend to consume things more earlier if possible, and potentially even use, for example, borrowing to facilitate that. And the third prediction, which is more nuanced, is that people who are sufficiently aware of this impatience may try to take steps to curb the effects of this impatience. And so we tend to label these things commitment devices. People may tend to seek or demand commitment devices that will help to control or to limit the effects of, say, procrastination or accelerant consumption. Okay, so we can go on to slide 6. In the next section, we'll be talking about the actual design of the experiment. So here we have a thought experiment that basically captures the main question that we'll be looking at. Okay, so we have in mind someone who is receiving an income tax refund and is now being offered an opportunity to save this refund, to deposit it in a savings account. And importantly, that savings account will be one that is of some sort of illiquid nature, so that the money deposited in this account will have to stay there at least for some period of time, potentially with some reward for keeping the money in for that specific period of time. Okay, so we first would consider someone who shows up at the tax site and now is offered a decision to deposit that money. They're trading off the benefit of having that money available now vis-a-vis the benefit of having that money available later, and potentially having more money available later if there is a savings match. But the decision, the timing of the benefits is that I can either consume this money now or I have to wait until some time later to consume. Okay, so Nicole, we can go to the next bullet point, slide 6. So we want to hold that example in mind, and now we want to look at an alternative scenario where someone has the same decision whether or not to save the income tax refund, but they can make the decision before the tax season. So before they show up at the tax site, at some point where we have a pretty good idea of what their refund will be, and we want to ask this person, would you like to open a savings account when you come in to file your taxes? Now the person is making a similar comparison about the benefits across time. They will either be able to have their refund available once they show up to the tax site, or they will have their refund available sometime even further in the future after they file their taxes. But both, from the vantage point of this decision maker, both things are happening in the future. So there's something that could happen later or even later in time. Okay, and so what we sort of hypothesize is that making this decision at some earlier point in time may lead the person to make different decisions and maybe actually be more likely to think that saving is a good idea because it's no longer a comparison between now and later. Nicole, you can go to the next bullet point. So our study attempts to implement this thought experiment. Now, in practice, we are not going to have as simple a setup for a number of reasons, many of which are just sort of constraints on what we can offer and what decisions can be binding or not. And so our actual implementation tries to get at this comparison of now versus later, later versus even later. But we have to be a little more clever about how we get at that. We can go on to slide 7, Nicole. Okay, so what is our approach? We're going to use a combination of tools, interviews, surveys, and also a savings product that we will randomly offer to some of the individuals in the study. And these things are used in combination to allow us to test for and measure these preferences, these present bias preferences, or I've mentioned or refer to them here, time inconsistent preferences, but basically to test for this phenomenon of impatience. Okay, we can go to the next bullet point. So we contact everyone prior to tax season and inform them of this savings incentive that will be offered during the time that they actually file their taxes. And a subset of individuals will be allowed to make what's called a soft commitment ahead of time. And I will define that in more detail in 1 second. But this gives you a basic idea of the timing. So, Nicole, we can go to the next slide. And so finally, during the actual tax season, when people show up, they make their final savings decision. And there are incentives that are offered that encourage one to save, and they in part depend on the previous commitment decisions for some of the individuals who have to make commitment decisions. Now, at this point, I'd like to mention or acknowledge that there seems to be a lot of moving parts. So we'll discuss them in a little more detail. But we'd also just like to point out that this global picture has a lot of moving parts, but to the extent possible for each individual in the study, they're presented with a much more simple structure that only pertains to their individual incentives. And then we look across individuals who have different types of incentives to try to draw some conclusions. Okay, so Nicole, we can go on to slide 8. So there are 2 basic subgroups in our study. The first group is used to measure what I'll deem baseline impatience. So this set of participants were offered a savings decision at tax time. They were offered a savings product that we labeled Save Up. In a second, I'll talk about the group that we collaborated with and sort of where this name is derived from, but it's a savings account that is illiquid. Nicole, you can go to the next bullet point. So the Save Up account is an illiquid savings account that requires one to leave money in there for 8 months. After keeping the money there successfully for 8 months, there is a savings match that is given to the individual. So at in its most basic sense, it's an account that you are offered that allows you to save money for 8 months, and if you successfully keep it there, then you will get a match at the end of those 8 months. Within the set of people offered this savings account, we added 2 additional incentives, depending on which group you were in within this general group. Some received an additional incentive to save, an extra $50, but that incentive would be received immediately. So the idea is that in addition to the baseline savings match, you can get an additional match, an additional amount added to your match, and you will have access to that portion of the match right now. Others were offered a delayed incentive, meaning that their savings match was increased, but it was still sort of backloaded. Everything still is withdrawn at the end of 8 months. Okay? And so what we did was measure the effect of the immediate and delayed incentives. And this gives us what I referred to before as a comparison between now, which typically took place in February, and later, which tended to be in October, 8 months later. So this first group gives us this baseline measure of impatience. How do people respond to an immediate incentive relative to a delayed incentive, now versus later? So, Nicole, we can go to the next slide. here we have another group of individuals that gives us a measure of what I'm going to refer to as relative impatience. Okay, so these people were offered a slightly different savings product called Save Upfront. Okay, and what this savings product did was it had similar features to Save Up, but it also involved a soft commitment option that happened prior to tax season. So this project involved contacting people prior to tax season. Nicole, you can go to the next bullet point. And so what the Save Up Front account is an account just like the Save Up account that you can open when you come to file your taxes. But in addition, individuals can elect ahead of time whether or not they predict that they will save or not. Okay, so you're asked in the fall to commit to either saving or to say that you cannot commit to saving. Okay? And the commitment is non-binding, which means that you can change your mind when you show up to the tax site. And this is just a reality that we couldn't hold people to this commitment, but we wanted to make them matter. And so when you do commit, if you successfully follow through with your commitment, whether your commitment was to save or your commitment or prediction was that you could not save, there's an additional reward for following through with your commitment. So committing to saving makes saving at tax time more rewarding. On the other hand, if you do not commit to save, then it makes not saving less costly. And what that means is that basically we wanted people to give accurate predictions, and so there's actually a reason why you would commit, and there's a reason why you would not commit if you really didn't think it was going to happen. And so we wanted to elicit these predictions from people in the form of a soft commitment. So now people in this group are making two decisions, whether or not to commit and then ultimately whether or not to save. And in this group, we gave extra incentives for people to encourage them to commit. Okay, again, the commitment decision is made prior to tax season, sometime in late November and early December. Okay, but the incentive for committing would be paid at different points in time. Okay, either it would be paid in February when you come to file your taxes, or it will be backloaded all the way into October. And the idea here is that we wanted to see how people respond to these benefits, which both happen in the future but at different points in time. And this gives us what I referred to earlier as the comparison between a benefit that happens later and a benefit that happens even later, so February versus October. So the question is, do people respond more strongly to an incentive in February versus one in October, which happens further in the future? And does it matter when they're making the decision, prior to tax season or on the spot during tax season? So there are a lot of details here, but hopefully this gives you a richer picture of what we attempted to do. So, Nicole, you can go to the next slide, slide 10, and then slide 11, where I'll talk about a little bit about how we implemented this study. So here in slide 11, I've listed some details of the different components and players that were needed to actually take this project and launch it. What I will talk about mostly today is the first year of the study, which took place in New York City around and during tax season 2011. The group that we partnered with, we were fortunate to find a partner, the Financial Clinic in New York City, which was willing to administer this project with us, or administer this study among their tax customers. So the Financial Clinic is a nonprofit focused on increasing financial security. They use a combination of short and long-term financial planning and coaching, and they also are involved in policy advocacy, and they also are involved in research projects such as this one. So they have a number of different ways in which they serve their constituents. Our study was focused on one of their tax sites, which was in Lower Manhattan. And that's going to be important. I'll come back to the geographic issues later. But in order to offer a savings account, we also needed a local bank to help to provide the actual savings accounts. We needed accounts where deposits could be made directly from the income tax refund, and then additional money could be deposited into the savings accounts. The savings matches the incentive. So we partnered with a local bank that was located in Bronx, New York. So geographically, these are different parts of New York City, which we'll keep in mind. And then we also had a number of research assistants. So we had staff from the financial clinic and also additional research assistants, mainly graduate students, but also generally we hire research assistants based in New York City and also based here in Chicago to help with the implementation of the study. Okay, so Nicole, we can go to slide 12. Okay, so prior to the tax season, we had to contact participants to enroll them in the study and to administer surveys, and also for those who made commitment decisions, we had to collect those decisions. Okay, so we administered phone interviews. We found that getting in contact with the participants was a long, drawn-out process. It involved multiple attempts to reach people. We combined mailings as well as phone interviews and voicemail and things of those nature to finally track down as many as we could. We also had to develop these savings accounts, and there were a lot of details that we had to sort of review in order to produce this savings account. It was basically a CD, but there are a lot of regulations that apply, and so it took a lot of work back and forth with the bank to arrive upon an account that was suitable for this study. We also used a lot of training and interaction with the financial clinic to help make sure that the study had a highest chance of succeeding, and it also we also wanted to be fully conscious of all of the issues that are generally faced when you're operating something within a tax season. So a lot of preparation was put into place. Nicole, we can go to the next slide. So now that we have contacted people prior to tax season, during the tax season was when tax returns were filed and accounts were open. So we had to develop a system for tracking people over time to know when they would show up to these tax sites or to catch them if they showed up to these tax sites at a time when they were not expected to show up. And so that we had to put things in place for that. The savings decisions were made at this time, and because some people had exited the study just due to general attrition, we also recruited a couple more participants on site to help augment our sample. So Nicole, we can go to the next slide, 14, and then to 15. So I will briefly summarize some of our major results. Okay, so the first point that became clear after starting the study is that attrition was a major obstacle. So we had an initial list of people that we wanted to contact based on clients from the previous tax season 2010. So we called these people in the fall and winter of 2011, and we were able to reach at most 40%, between 20 and 40%, depending on the treatment group. And so right there, our sample size decreased significantly. Now, if you go through the entire study, the share of people that actually completed the entire study, meaning they were called, they came to the tax site, and they made a final decision whether or not to open an account, that comprised roughly 10% of the original sample. Now, data was collected for more than 10% of the people over time, but the number of people who completed the entire study were 10%. So that created some statistical challenges, which I won't go into detail about, but I'll give you the sort of punchline from the first year of the study, which is that the predictions of the beta-delta model, or this model of present bias preferences, were generally borne out in the sense that the savings incentives increase people's likelihood to save, and for that first group that was on site, the effect of the immediate incentive was stronger than the effect of the delayed incentive. Okay, so what I mean here is that there were an increase of take-up of the savings account of 40 percentage points for those who were given this additional immediate incentive, whereas the delayed incentive only gave people an increase of about 10 percentage points. The next line shows you that in terms of those who were contacted prior to tax season, we gave them an incentive to help them to commit. This was the early and the late treatment. So here it says treatment. It says a delayed treatment here, but that should say late. Sorry for the typo. But whether it was an early or delayed incentive to help people to pre-commit, i.e. whether they were going to be paid in February or October, from the vantage point of, say, November, the effect was the same. It was sizable, but it was similar. So there was less of a difference. So there was an increase of about 30 percentage points for the probability of committing to saving, depending on whether you were offered one of these incentives. But when the incentive would be actually paid to you did not matter as much. So, Nicole, we can go to slide 16. So when we look at the ultimate effect on how much people deposited into these savings accounts, the $50 immediate incentive, as I pointed out, the incentive that was offered to people on the spot was many times greater than the delayed incentive. And if you look at the average savings deposit, those who were given an immediate incentive were depositing $200 more on average relative to the control group that deposited $400. The next bullet point, if you go to the next bullet point, Nicole, on slide 16, the commitment incentive was potentially stronger than the immediate incentive. So what does that mean? So people who were contacted ahead of time and given a chance to commit, we look at ultimately whether or not they saved and how much they saved. They tended to save $300 more than their baseline savings level of $300, so $600 on average for those who had a commitment incentive. However, this seems like a stronger intervention, but you have to balance that with the fact that when you contact people ahead of time, a lot of them do not show up to the tax season after the fact. And so you have to balance this stronger effect against the possibility that you will reach less people when you focus on people ahead of tax season as opposed to on the spot. Okay, so, and Nicole, if you go to the next slide, slide 17, and I'm almost finished. Through our first year of the study, we recognized really a number of challenges to implementation, which will also speak to whether or not such a product or savings product or study is scalable and applicable in other contexts. Okay, so the first thing is that recruitment and retention required a lot of resources. In particular, keeping people within the study over time seemed to be very hard to do, and it took a lot of resources and research assistants and things of that nature to keep people in the study. So when trying to stay with people over 2 tax seasons or even over time from November prior to tax season to the actual tax season, we found that there was a lot of slippage. The other thing is that with a tax preparation nonprofit like the Financial Clinic that has multiple sites, when trying to get people from sites, say, in Queens, New York, to participate in a project, but the project is only available in Manhattan, we also found that served to be a big challenge as well. So those are 2 things that you need to take into account. Your initial sample size may not match up with your ultimate sample size. We also were fortunate enough to find a bank that would partner with us. So we were lucky enough to find a bank that would work with us, but there were issues that we faced in terms of navigating banking regulations and also the accessibility of the bank. So the bank that we used was not sort of a bank with branches on every corner. And so that might have limited the effectiveness of the savings account, depending on whether people thought that they would be able to make it up to this bank to withdraw their money. We had a lot of personnel that were used, and so we had to leverage technology to make use of a lot of remote parties. So a lot of the data was entered on the web via a tool called Salesforce. And in addition, we had to make sure that we had quality control in place. So we used a lot of web-based training that made sure that everyone was getting the same information in terms of their training for how to implement our surveys and things of that nature. Finally, the most important thing was having the financial clinic, which was able to help to accommodate us and work with us on this study. Now, this is an organization that values research so much so that they are able to put some of their capacity towards doing these types of projects. But we realize that it's not necessarily possible for all organizations to do such a thing. So you want to be cognizant of the additional capacity that's going to be needed to do a study like this or to implement a new savings account like this. And the one thing that's not on this slide, but we also needed money to fund the savings matches. And so our results are most applicable to a place where savings match is being thought about, but in terms of how it's going to be designed, there are ways you could alter the design in terms of the timing of the savings match to perhaps increase participation. But there was an amount of funds that had to be raised through grants and things of that nature to help to put money into these accounts. So places where accounts are already being considered, and there are some places that do have these matches, some of our results could speak to how you might want to design this to be the most attractive to your participants. So, Nicole, if you go to the final slide, the last thing I want to say is that we're now in the middle of year two. Year two, you focused on tax season in 2012. We brought on more personnel. We tried to ramp up our training, and our preliminary results are still in being processed. We found that the incentives seem to work similarly to last year, in the first year, in terms of take-up and increased savings. Our evidence on the type of impatience that we've been talking about seems to be less robust, but we're still in a very preliminary stage of looking at the data. In terms of the question of whether savings accounts on the long term help make people better off, we're still conducting longitudinal analysis to try to answer those questions. So sorry for going a little over time, but looking forward to answering the question.
Okay, great. We'll turn this over to Mimi.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm looking at the slides here for the first time. I see this lovely old picture of myself. Isn't that nice? So that's me with the big orange scarf, if people are there. That's on the discussion page. So I'm moving to the slide that says Boston EITC Coalition History. I don't have my slides numbered, so I'll just do next slide from here on in. So hi, everybody. I'm Mimi Churchnetz. I'm the campaign director for the Boston EITC campaign. I have a couple of slides of history, just that we are a campaign in Boston, launched in 2001, so we're currently moving into the 12th tax season. We are a public-private partnership. I work for the Mayor's Office of Jobs and Community Services for Mayor Menino, but the campaign is public-private with a lot of community partners and regulators, the Boston Fed Reserve, FDIC. Oh, my God, my phone is ringing. I have to shut it off. Sorry, everybody. And local community partners like Action for Boston Community Development, Dotwell, D2D, and others. Next slide. We have been running a tax campaign here, as I said, for going into the 12th year. We kind of started small like most tax campaigns. Our first year we had 12 sites and did about 500 returns. We've now, 11 years later, had 24 sites last year, did close to 12,000 tax returns. Over the past 11 years, we've served 90,000 taxpayers, and those taxpayers directly received $100 million in tax credits and refunds. We also are committed to doing this work in multilingual capacity through something called the Ambassador Program. So we do this in 7 languages, and we are completely committed to inclusion and disability access. Next slide. So for folks who are kind of new to this field, if there are people in the call that are, there's a real collaborative effort between the free tax field and the asset building field, and over the past decade there's been a real attempt to integrate savings and asset building into free tax preparation. So in a lot of ways, the Boston campaign grew up in that work. We were funded, like a lot of the tax work, by the Casey Foundation and some others that really helped to think through some of this stuff. A lot of folks across the country were doing work around savings strategies. We have a pretty extensive annual taxpayer survey, and we learned from our taxpayers that they were more interested in credit advising and issues around credit than they were about banking per se. although 20% of folks in Boston are unbanked or underbanked. But we kind of took the cue from them and focused on credit advising. So we started doing free one-on-one credit advising sessions. We have a partnership or a contract with TransUnion, so we do one-on-one credit advising sessions. We where folks get their credit report and their FICO score. And we actually, in kind of thinking about Damon's presentation, we have done a bunch of different studies here, and we did do kind of a behavioral economics research project 1 year, I think maybe a couple of years. We had credit advising, but we focused at one site with a raffle where people would come in and they would have the opportunity to play this raffle, and they would get, if they made a commitment to do credit advising, they would, in fact, potentially win, $50 or whatever on the spot. It was really a lot of fun and great, and I think that in the research, part of what we found is that in as much as Damon found this too, is that the present bias preferences, folks who really had this issue of not having this bias to spend now, to want impulse now, were much more likely to borrow and less likely to save. And we saw that also, that those folks were much less likely to participate in the credit advising. And we've got a paper that I can let people see. It's on the Fed website, but I can make sure that people have access to that. We've also done asset building with the savings bonds. Next slide. So one of the things that we tried to do as a kind of a behavioral economics pilot this past tax season is we implemented something we would call the financial checkup, to try to utilize an opt-out strategy to increase credit advising while also providing intake, eligibility screening, and benefits referral. So instead of having, for people who have done, this is kind of the old model of cash advisor that the folks in Rita Eigerbrug's folks in New York were doing. But this is actually really trying to have the intake person also be trained on credit advising, also be trained on eligibility screening and benefits, and so that it's soup to nuts for that person, so that the taxpayer is not passed around. Ultimately, the idea was, in my eyes, the goal was to expand and increase credit advising and use it as an asset building tool. One of the significant differences with this kind of strategy versus some of the work that Damon and folks have done is that all the financial guides are volunteers. So as people know, volunteers that the challenges are much more significant. Even just the drop-off rate, 18 people were trained, only 11 participated. This is one tax site where we did this. 1,350 intake sessions were provided, and of that, only 467 credit advising sessions and 505 benefits referrals were made. Next slide. This pilot, really, I thought that the results were going to be much better. One of the things that I don't have on the past slide, which is really significant, is that it ended up being a great system for tax preparation, because the rate for the amount of errors, the tax error rate went down dramatically at that tax site, but that was interesting. That's not what we're trying to do. Anyway, lessons learned just briefly. Training protocol is very, very hard to try to do this kind of work with working with volunteers, and you're not with, have a research agent, Fed, whomever, doing the work with you. The volunteer tax site model makes this kind of work really hard to implement. Our opt-out idea, I think I was clear on what I was trying to do. We did not develop the right messaging for the intake and the credit advising staff. Once again, the tax sites are transactional. You really need to be building a relationship. It's hard to do it in this particular methodology. Once again, like Damon identified, it's really an issue of resources and training, and we need more research dollars to do this work, which we would really like to do. Next slide, open questions. This obviously we can talk about. There's not going to be a whole lot of time, but has providing annual credit advising at our Boston tax sites created behavioral changes. We do know that people are coming into the tax sites and asking for getting their credit reports pulled. We do have longitudinal data that we're trying to do a study of now. We know that there's been changes. The question is how dramatic, how significant. Can the volunteer model really improve training protocols such that the results in data can be better and tell us more? What are the lessons from these pilots and experiments that can be integrated into the tax sites across the field? And I think the theory of savings at tax sites continues to be compelling. Can we, what are the findings of the pilots? Are they replicable? Are they scalable? It's very hard. Everybody knows how hard it is to do this and then do lessons learned and then integration. And, in thinking about this in terms of what do we have out there, savings bonds still might be the best tax time savings mechanism. And for folks who know, they're currently threatened, the tax time savings bond strategy. So I think that we, for those of us who are committed to savings at tax time, we need to do work with DCD around trying to save that strategy. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Mimi. All right, we'll turn it over to David Rothstein. David?
Hi, thanks very much. So I'm David Rothstein with Policy Matters Ohio and the New America Foundation, and I'm excited to reflect a little bit on what Damon and Mimi have had to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pilot that we did in Franklin County, which is where Columbus, Ohio is, and talk about some of our results, but also sort of reflect a little bit on some of the work that also my colleagues have done at New America, and Rachel Black and Reed Kramer, who have written a little bit on the Save NYC model over time. So you can go to the first slide if you want. So in Franklin County, the program was called Save Now Plus because there was a program that already existed called Save Now that was administered through the state of Ohio, and it was a linked deposit program where other banks were actually able to partner with the Department of Treasury, the state treasurer, and actually get a 3% interest bonus for accounts that were opened as savings accounts. The accounts had to be open for a month, and 12 months, and on that final month, a 3% interest match was basically put on to the end of the account. So, and they did it up to $5,000. So it was a little back-end sort of bonus and match there. We offered it to 400 clients that were picked at random through about three of the free tax sites in the Free Tax Coalition. They had to open a new account, and that was part of the account opening process. And this was through PNC Bank, who had the relationship as a Save Now partner already with the state treasurer's office. We asked them to put in a minimum of $100 from their tax refund, splitting it at tax time. They received, and you'll notice all of this sort of behavioral economic twist that we have when we designed this program. We leveraged a lot of the existing research that was out there. And so we didn't want to do all of the bonus at once because we felt like if we wanted to change behavior and see how that worked, we wanted sort of a staggered bonus approach so that we could see that they were depositing some of their money that wasn't actually coming from the tax refund later on down the line. And that was sort of the goal. So the initial savings deposit, we asked for $100. The enrollment bonus of $50 came almost instantaneously when their tax refund split with that $100. We asked them to make an additional deposit of at least $20 between February and June of 2012. And the minute that they, or the day that they did that, then they would receive another bonus of an additional $25 from the coalition. And then we asked them for another $20 between June and September of 2012. and then they received the larger part of the savings bonus, which was $75. We felt like looking at the various models that were out there, the largest hurdle that most of these programs have, obviously, is to keep the account open for longer than 6 months. And so with that, we designed with the banks this way to kind of keep it going over time. And then finally, in month 12, which we haven't hit yet, they would receive their state of Ohio 3% bonus on the Save Now linked deposit part of the program. And so you can see on that slide kind of how it maps out for varying degrees of initial savings deposits. Certainly we didn't have anyone that put in $1,000, but we had a lot of people who got sizable refunds, so we thought that it could very well be a possibility. You can go to the next slide. So the program, we got similar results of take-up rates. The take-up rate wasn't enormous, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. We had 80 clients participate. We had a very low dropout rate once they were enrolled, and I think that's for a couple reasons. One, program staff was extremely strong. We had 2 people at the United Way who were in constant communication with the folks who opened these accounts, and I think that was a big part of it. And then also, because we had the staggered savings and they were reminded of it, that was really helpful, I think, in the continuation of those accounts, because they said, well, if I can just wait, maybe another couple of months, I'll get that bonus, and that's really important to me. They had pretty instant access to the account by PNC Bank when it was put into place, which I think was also very important to them. And then also they received monthly emails with at least 3 saving tips or plans around budgeting, around how to manage their account, about sort of reminders that, free tax season is coming back again next year, those kind of tips. And I'm happy to send anyone who's interested sort of samples of what those look like. And again, those were things that we also put, copy and pasted from different things that were already out there and we thought looked pretty good and were helpful reminders. They also received via text message and email reminders when there were deadlines to make deposits so that they could ensure that they got bonuses and incentives that were structured out through the program. And we had, again, asked for permission to do that throughout. Now, one of the interesting parts of this is that it sounds like it was a CD, but it really wasn't a certificate of deposit. I mean, this was we advertised this and fully promoted it as an emergency savings account. So one of our baseline measures was actually not how much they had in the account at the end of the pilot project. That's not what the measure was, because we want them to use it as an emergency savings account, and we wanted the account to be liquid so that it was easily accessible so they could pull money out and then put money back in as they needed it. So that's maybe a little bit different of a program than some of the other ones that are out there. And the other thing was we encouraged for a lot of different accounts and linkages. So the idea was a lot of people opened a savings account, and some of them didn't even have checking accounts. So one of the goals was to, once they got this account and saw how easy it was to manage and they began to like it, the goal was also to help them open a savings account and maybe link those 2 accounts together so that they could do some direct deposits from their checking account to their savings account. You can go to the next slide. So these are some lessons learned not only from our pilot, but also from some of the other ones that are out there. I think one of the challenges that we all have is doing promotion ahead of the tax time decision-making process, right? So it's very hard to spring this upon somebody when they come into the tax site for a lot of reasons. One, if they already have a bank account, they might not want another bank account, even with these bonuses. That's a big hurdle to overcome. Also, I think it's really important that we sort of think about, the different, what banks mean to different people. So the fact that it was a PNC bank might have turned off some people, and for other people, it might have been a good choice. But I think problems in these pilots are that oftentimes we're only giving them one choice. And, as Damon mentioned, while there are some PNC branches in the cities that we did this in, they're not on every street corner. They might not be totally accessible to certain people. And they might have had a bad experience in the past with that particular bank. So the label could be sort of challenging. I think one of the other problems is we advertised this and we sort of marketed this as this really great opportunity and something that we were featuring, which is all very true. The problem is that people are adverse, I think, to new products, and even if they do have some kind of a bonus or incentive to them, and even if they are beneficial. So I think one of the things that we should try to do and consider is there a way to do this as more of a default option? So to say to somebody that comes into the site, as of right now, guess what? You're on this Super Saturday in February at our free tax site. The good news for you is that you automatically qualify and you are currently enrolled to, receive this $100 bonus at this tax site. And right now you're, going to be set up with that bank account. Is that something that you want to keep, or do you want to, opt out and remove that? And this comes from obviously the behavioral economic literature about opting in and opting out. And I think we really have to think more about that. And then I think the other thing is we were actually able to do this towards the latter half of the tax season, which was have some of these bank accounts already pre-populated before people came in. And with some of the new banking laws, that's becoming more and more challenging. But one of the problems is people, when we interviewed people who didn't enroll in the program, they were very open to say, I would have done this if I already had a bank account created and it wasn't something I was doing at tax time. Or some of the people that had savings accounts already said, well, why can't I just add this onto my existing savings account, right? And I think those are legitimate things to think about because it would be a more seamless process for us. And then I think, as Mimi said, I think we have to really think about how scalable can we be with these incentives? Because I think one of the other responses that we got from some of the surveys and focus groups we did about people who didn't enroll is that they're sort of saying, quite frankly, $100 isn't enough or $150 isn't enough, right? And so I think that there's a real question there as to how much of a bonus can we do to nudge people into action that makes sense for them. And I think that's something we're still trying to explore, and I think it's something that is a quantitative question that we can really kind of measure. And then I think one of the large factors surrounding all of this, and Rachel Black and I at New America are doing a little work on this, is as the EITC and other refunds get larger, how do we address that in this sort of savings at tax time structure, right? If people, the question is maybe if people had access to those dollars throughout the year in more of a periodic EITC sort of structure, would they be more willing to save some of their refund at tax time because they don't need it all? They're not counting on $4,000 to catch up on all of their bills, or it's not already spent, right? So if they had access to that capital during the year, maybe they would be more inclined to save at particular times during the year when, like tax time. And I think that's something that we really need to look at because I think that's part of the shortfall of income is a real part of why people are saying, I'm not really that interested in saving because, quite honestly, this money is already spent. Where was this account opportunity 3 months ago when I before I went to the payday lender, I really needed my own emergency savings account, right? And then I think one of the other things that we picked up from some of our focus groups and informal interviews with some of these people who didn't choose to enroll in this account was there's still a lot of negative perception around banks and bank accounts right now. One of the reasons, obviously, we've seen such strong reactions in the positive to prepaid debit cards is that people are just not as happy with brick-and-mortar bank accounts right now. And I think we tend to underestimate that and maybe think that by providing an incentive or a bonus, we can recover some of those ill feelings. But I think it's going to take a lot more than maybe we anticipated. And maybe this is just maybe time will heal those wounds. I'm not sure. But I do think that we have to think about, how do we heal the sort of perceptions around, well, I really don't want a bank account. I've had to go to check systems, or I've, dealt with overdraft for the last 5 years. I don't even want to open another bank account. And so I think those are real structural things that we have to address, and they really connect to what Mimi was saying about the idea of savings bonds, and that maybe that is the universal product that we should be thinking about building upon. Maybe there's some way to do a savings bond product that's more of a prepaid card in some way that it's really a savings bucket card. and it's not branded in the sense that it's not a card that comes from a particular bank, but it's more of a government program that encourages you to save, and you can just continue to build on that at tax time. And then the final thing I'll mention is that it's, and Mimi said this, and Damon mentioned this too, so just to bring it home maybe, it's really hard to implement this program because tax forms and the structure of creating, accounts, it's really not seamless, and it's really hard to do at tax time. So if we can create some sort of option on the tax form that allows us to create a bank account in the way of splitting the refund and do it more seamlessly than the 4 steps or so that it at least takes to do it, I think that would also sort of encourage the sites and the people that are doing taxes to be more excited about doing savings at tax time. And with that, I hope that we have some time for questions for everybody.
Great. Thank you, David. We do have some time for questions, and so I'll go ahead and this one, Damon, is for you. Could you please talk,
okay.
Let's see here. What happened after 8 months in the study? Did people keep money in the savings account, or did they tend to withdraw the money?
That's a good question. So I currently do not have the answer to that. We're still compiling some of the more longitudinal results of the study, so I can't answer that directly. I do know from other studies that kind of had a similar design that you do tend to see people leaving some of their money in the account even after they have received the match. But in terms of the quantities or the share of people that continue to keep money in that account, I do not have those results on hand, unfortunately, right now.
So people will have to stay tuned for your final report on the study. This
Yeah.
one, I'll start with you, Damon, and then Mimi, if you want to weigh in, and maybe even David as well. But can you talk about the incentive structures associated with your projects? How big was the incentive? How was it delivered?
Yeah, well, in our case, basic idea is that to open an account, you had to deposit at least $300. And then for every dollar above $300, there was a 50% match. So 50 cents to the dollar. And then the cap was at about $1,000. And so that was the basic structure. And then there were these additional incentives of $50 that were given for opening and keeping an account open for 8 months. And when you received those $50 varied, whether you would have access to that $50 up front or you have to wait until the end of 8 months to have access to that additional $50. And then finally, there was an additional layer for some groups. For people who made a pre-commitment in November, their account was even more generous. They started with a match of $100 for opening an account of at least $300, in addition to the 50% match for every dollar over $300. So that was an incentive to commit ahead of time because it allowed a savings account to be more rewarding when you opened it.
And so then for us, we've only actually done the credit advising incentive with the raffle, and that was done at one of the tax sites, the Roxbury Resource Center, which is a large walk-in site, and so it felt a bit like a carnival atmosphere. So we did this about, maybe 6 years ago, 5 years ago, when people would come in and they would take a raffle and then immediately know whether or not they won. And I don't know what the percentage of people who were winning, but I think that you could get up to $50, and that was kind of a way to get people into the tax sites, but into getting credit advising. But we have not done the kind of match in a savings piece. We've never had that kind of funding through banks. So that was the way that we did our incentive.
Great. So we have time for just one more question that just came in, and this is: do any of the programs have funding or resources to do another savings project this coming tax season? So
we are going to do ours. So this is Mimi. We're going to do ours, but we don't have funding for it yet, but we're going to do it anyways. And the challenge with us is that ours is primarily volunteer-driven, which obviously people know makes the results, it's harder. But we're going to do what we did, and we're now debating as to the level of growth.
This is Damon. Currently, we don't have plans or funding to do an additional project this year. We found that we had to start applying for money a little more earlier than now for something to happen in tax season, say 2013, probably in the spring or the summer, to start reaching out to funding organizations and in order to have that money in place, because things tend to start months before the tax season. But, so currently for this next tax season, we currently wouldn't have any funding to pursue that.
This is David. We do have another round of funding to do the sort of pilot project just like we did last year. We're going to try to make some tweaks to it, but we still like the idea of staggering the bonus or incentives, whatever you want to call them, throughout the year, because we feel like that has helped people continue to maintain and care about their accounts. So I think we'll probably design it in a similar way, but with much more aggressive outreach beforehand. And we have had some challenges about the buy-in for doing the opt-in approach that we'd like to try, the opt-out approach, that is, where we have people sort of almost default in taking some of their refund if they qualify for a large enough refund. So the concept was maybe would we see improved results if people that were getting up $2,000 in a refund were sort of automatically enrolled in this, and if they told us, no, I really don't want that, and, we weren't able to sort of convince them that it might be a good thing for them because it might not, then, they would be able to opt out of it, obviously, and still get their taxes done for free. So we're still in the planning stages, so if you have some things that they think we should be trying or things that they think we're doing terribly wrong, we're certainly open to hearing those things.
Okay, great. Well, I would like to thank our presenters, thank our participants for being available today. And this webinar and the slides will be archived on the CFS website, cfs.wisc.edu/webinars. And please save the date for the next webinar, which is Tuesday, October 9th. And you'll receive an email with the topic and registration link. Thanks and have a great day.